What makes the achievement of emotional sobriety so difficult is the habits we have, the patterns we have in our behavior, the habitual ways that we've come to think about things. We have to really become aware of those things in order to challenge them, because the consciousness that has created a lot of the problems in our life cannot solve it, cannot change things. So what happens is the first step is waking up. So tonight we are starting our discussion of step number 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And Herb is going to be leading off our discussion tonight. And so I'll welcome Herb into the room. And good evening, Herb, and thank you for kicking us off on step 6.
My name is Herb, and I am an alcoholic. The whole purpose of the step process is a spiritual awakening. And step 6 reads, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Now, G-O-D, that word, if you have any issue with it, just neutralize it by putting the word power in there. The simple approach, as I've distilled it down to the first 3 steps, is I need help, either addiction or unmanageability, pathetic Herbie there, in the bondage of addiction and in the bondage of unmanageability. I need help. I come to a place in step 2 of a faith decision. That is, there is a power available, help's available. I need help, help's available. Step 3 is asking for help. There's that willingness of step 2 to believe in the wind. Interestingly enough, the word spirit comes from the Greek word spiros, which means breath, and is the derivative word for spirit. It's like catching the wind. It's like not possible, and yet our very life depends on it. The silver bullet of the 12-step process and the big book is that there's no dogma there. There's no must or requirement there. It's really your choice. What is your choice about help? What is your choice about a power other than yourself that will be able to pull you out of the ditch? That faith decision. There's no knowledge or certitude attached to it. There's no feeling or emotion attached to it. It's very thin, it's very dark, it's very empty. It's like Indiana Jones standing at the chasm that was in front of him, knowing that he had to get to the other side, but there was no possible way, and he extended his leg and the path appeared. It's kind of like that. It's a great image of what faith is. And we go forward into the journey of dismantling the false self so that that true self can emerge. We build a brick wall, a cinder block wall, with the delusion that it's going to protect us from the slings and arrows, if you will. Life as it manifests. This cinder block wall is going to protect me. And then we realize, oh my God, it's a prison. I've built my own prison. That's a spiritual awakening, to have that very thought. And steps 4 and 5 are the beginning of the naming of the wall and the responsibility that I have for constructing it and for deconstructing it in sort of a co-creation or a co-construction or a partnership, managing partner, regular partner. Partnership's just a great word with life. Partnership with power other than myself. And we come to step 6. After we have done step 4, where we have that deflation of our ego at depth, we get to the exact nature. We're not looking at the skin tone. We're getting underneath. We're doing soul surgery. And we get underneath the family of origin issues and the psychological, emotional issues and the mental and other kinds of distortions and delusions and obsessions and compulsions issues, so that we can come up with the objective truth. The whole point of step 4 is to find the truth. The whole step 5 is to find the truth. And once we've experienced those steps, not just knowing them, but have experienced them, and that's a process like a dimmer switch that happens over time, an organic process, not an event. We realize, at least I did, that I was fully responsible, 100% responsible for my thoughts and my feelings, and especially my behavior, and that I had exactly the life that I had constructed. Bill talks about instincts, fight, flight, and freeze. That's a structural, we have a structural problem in one sense. These instincts aren't the problem. These instincts are our survival mechanisms. Bill Wilson calls it defects. Dr. Berger calls it default positions. They're survival, they're safety reactions. The reaction of anger, the reaction of fear, the reaction of hiding, just for survival, for safety. Nothing wrong so far until we get into the emotions where we're holding the anger, we're holding the fear, we're disabled by our shame and our secrets. Bill says the root of this problem is our self-centeredness, and the whole purpose and process of the 12 steps, the whole methodology is to turn from that self-centeredness to reality, to turn from self-centeredness, the unhealthy, false self, to a relationship with life that's healthy, to a relationship with myself that's healthy, to a relationship with other people that's healthy. A process of turning and a willingness to be turned. That's not a throwaway line. It's cute, it's poetic, it has a nice ring to it if you've really listened to it, but it's not a throwaway line. That's the willingness and grace, mysterious combination that is, in fact, the formula, I believe, that can't be explained, but it can be examined and it can be experienced. My willingness to turn by doing the work, my willingness to be turned by having the humility to submit to, if you will, the fact that there is some power that I cannot manage and or control. Some people call it grace. Some people call it God or power or higher power or nature or spirit. As I mentioned about step 2, the point is not that we understand it. The point is that we act as if it's true. It's almost paradoxical. It's kind of like one of those koans. I don't know it's true, I don't feel it's true, and I don't want to do it. But when I move my feet in that direction and I look back over my shoulder, something magical happens. Magical, mysterious, mystical. I change in a way that no other human development process was able to change me so radically. Oh, I changed through religion. I changed through therapy. I changed through my education. I changed through self-help and self-development. Absolutely. But not the radical change that was inside of me, in contrast to the superficial change in which I was able to manage and manipulate to become more or less a decent person, not coming from the insides, but because I wanted to fit in my community. Step 6 is a process of identifying both the inclinations and behavior. That's not in the big book that way, or in the 12 and 12, but it's absolutely my experience to help me identify what's the role of God. I'll use that term just as a placeholder to make my conversation more efficient. What's the role of God and grace, and what's the role of Herb and action and responsibility? I'm responsible for my behavior. I'm not responsible to change my inclinations. When I named these character defects, I had probably 30 or 40 of them at the time, 4 years sober. And I was specific with those, and I distilled them down to what I saw to be the characteristics that were indicated in the 4th step. Instincts gone awry, resentment that anger held, fear, that disabling anxiety, the shame that came from being dishonest, especially in my inappropriate sexual behavior, seeing the root cause as selfishness and self-centeredness. It's very important from my standpoint and the people I work with to be specific. Defects of character is the term Bill used. He wrote the book in 1939. Today, we would use much different language. Dr. Berger taught me that. In my day in psychology training, it was ego defense mechanism. Today, it's unhealthy coping strategies, a much better terminology with much less negativity to it. Unhealthy coping strategy, a willingness to have them removed. There's the key again. In each of the inventory steps, the key to inventory is that willingness. Willingness to have the humility to put a word on paper, to name the disturbance in me. That disturbs me. Why am I disturbed? Because I'm going against principles. This whole process taught me about principles. This whole process, as Dr. Berger just mentioned, is about alignment with reality, alignment with principles. I need to know what the principles are. I need to accept them as principles. These are the clouds that are blocking the light in me from me. These going against principles, self-will run riot. And he says in the big book, addicts are extreme examples. All human beings suffer unmanageability. Bill calls them the bedevilments, the behavioral description of selfishness, self-centeredness, the bedevilments. Look it up in the dictionary. It's a wonderful definition. It's a wonderful, rich word. To be controlled as if by devils. My approach to emotional sobriety, my experience with steps 4 through 7, is I was a puppet on strings. People, events, circumstances. There were strings attached to. And I came to realize and accept that I had attached the strings. And I also had the responsibility and some of the power to cut the strings. That's good psychology. But when I bring faith in, it becomes better theology. To remove the clouds blocking the light, to remove the obstacles to my relationship with myself. We're talking about emotional sobriety, we're talking about self-esteem, we're talking about a process to, in fact, rehabilitate our self-esteem so that, in fact, we can live in emotional sobriety. That is, identifying the disturbances in us and owning them, that we're responsible for it. I have a worksheet in my Way of Life document that I have because it helps people get from just this identification of the character defect to the potential opposite virtue, which will allow them then to have a vision of what's the antidote to this character defect? If I'm dishonest, well, the obvious principle is honesty, but there are many things that aren't so obvious. And when I have people do this exercise, Yes, name the character defect. Yes, why do you have it? Yes, what are you defending? Great question. With my defect, I am defending something. What am I defending? What am I trying to be safe from? How am I trying to be survival? And if I didn't have the character defect, what would be the virtue coming from the Latin virtus, which means strength? What would be the asset in me, the character quality in me that would be the opposite of the defect that I'm looking at? And then what would the behavior be? I've heard it said, and I now have read it in Dr. Dan Siegel's work. He's a psychiatrist at UCLA, that when we behave differently, we change our brain. This is revolutionary. We didn't know it 25 years ago, scientifically. We knew it spiritually. We knew it from a personal and human development standpoint for thousands of years. Your sponsor knew it without any science. He said, I don't care how you think. I don't care what you know. I don't care how you feel. I don't care what your emotions are. Here's what I want you to do. You do that, and someday you'll know better and you'll feel better. That's the science of UCLA in their brain technology. We change our brains. Synapses that fire together, wire together. We create new neuronal paths in our brain when we behave differently. The whole point of this process is based on really good psychology. Disclose it so that I don't have any secrets begins the removal process. To name the specific impediments, these clouds in me that block me from the light, and to, in all humility, to realize I can name it, I can want to change it, and I can try to change it, but I just can't do it on my own. And step 7, as we'll look at in a little bit, several weeks maybe, it's about prayer, and we'll talk about that when we get there. The whole point of step 6 is to acknowledge that I'm responsible, and yet I'm powerless. The humility, and yet I'm responsible. The distinction I referred to earlier is I'm powerless over my instincts and inclinations. Powerless, it's structural, but I'm 100% responsible for my behavior. And when in the grace of God, my willingness takes me to behave differently, and I hold myself accountable, a huge issue for a huge ingredient of step 7, which I'll talk about when we get there. Accountability. Prayer because I'm powerless. Action because I'm responsible. Accountability because I'm human. I'm in jail, the bondage of addiction and the bondage of self. The bondage of self is much more subtle and much more subversive. I want to be free so that I can drop those bars, realizing that the only inhibition to my life flourishing is that I'm holding the bars in front of my face.
Tom, you have red suspenders on tonight.
I almost always have red suspenders on. I usually just have a vest on instead also. I like my red suspenders.
You have red suspenders. Good evening, Raj.
Good evening, Al. Good evening, everyone.
Well, why don't you kick us off, Raj, then Tom, and then I'll take up the.
You'll clean up.
I'll do the cleanup position. I'll be the cleanup. Number four in the batting order.
First of all, thank you very much, Herb, for that informative and inspiring talk. So much content in there. I want to go immediately to trying to connect, as we've done with each of the steps to self-esteem. And as you've heard us mention, we're using psychotherapist and self-esteem theorist Nathaniel Branden's work primarily when we're talking about self-esteem. And in his books, and there are a lot of them that he wrote about self-esteem, Nathaniel doesn't talk much at all about powerlessness, and he doesn't talk much at all about humility. But he does talk a great deal about reality and the importance of aligning our thoughts and our perspective and our functioning in our life as deeply and thoroughly as possible with reality. And I'd like to kind of turn the idea of powerlessness, and you've done this, Herb, in prior meetings. If we also, in addition to the other terms you've said that we can substitute if we find it helpful for the term God, and you mentioned several, spirit, nature, grace. But if we also add another term and just talk about it in terms of reality, part of coming into reality is coming into the reality of who I am, not just understanding the reality outside of me. And it seems to me like steps 5 and 6 take us right to the heart of that issue, is beginning to help me see my blind spots, beginning to help me, as I see my blind spots more clearly, begin to develop genuine humility about my functioning. It's interesting that one approach to building self-esteem, very rarely, and that's Brandon's approach I'm talking about, very rarely uses the term spirituality. Whereas another approach, the 12-step approach, as you say, is all about spiritual awakening. And yet, with regard to self-esteem, I think they're talking about exactly the same thing.
Mhm.
We can use different language. I'm always kind of struck by that one of the criticisms leveled at self-esteem theory sometimes is that it's too focused on self. And I think about that, and you can also talk about an approach based on selflessness, right? But when you get down to what virtues are actually being talked about, to what behaviors are actually being encouraged and what behaviors are actually being discouraged, to me, there's a huge area of meeting where they're talking about exactly the same thing. Because as we've said, we're not talking about unhealthy self-centeredness with self-esteem. And you're not talking about, certainly, unhealthy self-centeredness with regard to the 12 steps and with regard to emotional sobriety. Both of them identify unhealthy self-centeredness as the problem. Let me give an example. Brandon, one of the ways he talks about unhealthy self-centeredness is to talk about pseudo self-esteem, fake self-esteem. From his book, How to Raise Your Self-Esteem, Brandon wrote, genuine self-esteem is not expressed by self-glorification at the expense of others, or by the quest to make oneself superior to others, or to diminish others so as to elevate oneself. Now, all of those ideas, if we don't understand the idea of self-esteem very deeply, can be looked at as aspects of self-esteem. And Brandon is saying, no. These are the furthest things from self-esteem. The genuine self-esteem is not comparative. It's not competitive. It's about coming into reality. Arrogance, boastfulness, and the overestimation of our abilities reflect inadequate self-esteem rather than, as some people imagine, too much self-esteem. Well, as I look at my list of, how did you term them? Unhealthy coping strategies and ego defense mechanisms, at times, all of these, arrogance, boastfulness, overestimation of my abilities, comparativeness, competitiveness, and I could go on, as we all could, I believe, in terms of what Bill referred to as our character defects. So whether we talk about it as surrender to God's will, or we talk about it as surrender to reality as we best can understand it, we're talking about the same thing from my perspective.
Identical. Yeah, they're totally identical.
And so that's the fundamental point I want to make, that identifying these shortcomings, I'll use that word as I think of them in myself, that I need and want to change, that's in part about my own happiness. That's in part about my contributing more to the happiness of others. And so I like to kind of try to break up a lot of these false distinctions and false conflicts that I think we can get into. A lot of it really is about semantics. And if we can clear away a lot of the semantic confusion, there's very little conflict to me between what the 12 steps are talking about, what emotional sobriety is talking about, and what self-esteem theory, properly understood, is talking about. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Wow. To me, you guys are sounding more and more like preachers.
How did that happen?
Right.
Praise me.
Next week, Herb will be here in his robe. So get ready, you guys. He's gonna put out.
Oh man, it's not. Herb's not the leader of the pack when it comes to preaching. It's you, Alan. It's like,
Oh my God!
you're the preacher. No, now, Roger's right there behind you. Sometimes when he gets that spark, it's like you want.
Amen, brother. Amen, brother.
If the offering plate. If the offering plate came by, I'd put money in. Yeah.
You remind me, I have a long way to go with regard to humility. As Ben Franklin said, as Ben Franklin wrote in his autobiography, as he was trying to develop the 13 virtues that he identified, he identified 12, but some Quaker friends told him that he should add humility because they had noted he seemed quite prideful and arrogant in his way. So he did add humility. With regard to humility, he said, he'd made a great deal of progress with regard to the appearance of humility, using the right language, using occasionally the right behaviors, having the right demeanor. But with regard to the substance, he had made precious little progress indeed. And it's beautiful, the insight that guy had.
Step 5 there. He was working step 5 and 4.
Well, there you go. There you go. Go ahead, Tom.
It reminds me of the little therapeutic one-liner nutshell I wrote for somebody a long while back that it says, I call it the narcissist prayer of gratitude. And it goes like this: thank you, God, I couldn't have done better myself. The ultimate compliment,
Right.
So, man, this is one of those deals where I write, I underline, I do all this stuff. But let me just start off with the 12 and 12 here. Right at the very beginning, I believe Bill is quoting a clergyman who happens to be one of AA's greatest friends, he says. And it says, any person capable of enough willingness and honesty to try, I love this, to try repeatedly step 6 on all his faults, without any reservations, whatever, without any, not whatever, but without any reservations, whatever, has indeed come a long way spirituality, and is therefore is entitled to be called a man, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I thought what Herb was talking about. I just changed the word man to adult, because this is about coming into being an adult. It's like, I have with hindsight, but with hindsight, I really have some very strong experiences with learning to own, and it really came with I didn't think of it at the time as step 6, but repeatedly using step 6. It's like, and it's a way of life at this point. We talked last time, and I talked about the step 5 being you open the double doors, and here comes the honesty. Now here comes the work, the work of being a real adult, and to me, my definition of adult used to be, back in the old days, it used to be, the way somebody looked or acted and dressed and what kind of job they had and stuff. But ultimately, through all the work I did in therapy, especially around the heavy duty child within the inner child work, you know, my definition of adult became, I am the person who is responsible to take care of the child inside of me. And really it expands to, I am the parent and the person responsibility to take care of all of the aspects of who I am inside. It doesn't mean I don't need lots of help. It doesn't mean I don't need help spiritually. It doesn't mean I don't need your guys' help. What it means, though, is I am the one in charge. You know, I take care of my, you know, so I always began to drop back to the idea. So that makes me a single parent. So I need a lot of support.
Right.
Because I've got, you know, and as we all know, who've done a lot of inner child work, it's not inner child. That's silly. It's inner children. Because at various ages, you know, where those developmental needs went unmet. So what I'm seeing, what I began thinking about is step 6 being the daily practice of being an effective adult, and the second piece about this is what that requires, and I think step 6 really speaks to this. Requires is one of the things we're going to have to let go of. One of these defects we let go of is we have to at least, to be that effective adult, we have to at least be working on letting go of perfectionism. You know, people often think that they can save that one for later. I think, you know, it's like, it's so crucial. And one of the things I'm always telling people is you can't just not do something. Like, don't think of the color blue. Well, that's not going to work, you know. So if you don't want to think of the color blue, then what are you going to do instead? Well, I'll tell you what, once you think of you know, the color yellow and a mouse, you know, so I'll give you something else to focus on. And so with perfectionism, what I tell people is what you're going to focus on is, and you can choose your own words, but the ones I use are determination and persistence. It's like, you know, and the idea in step 6 in the 12 and 12, it makes it so, I want to read this little piece because it's so addresses perfectionism to me. If we would gain any real advantage to the use of this step on problems other than alcohol, and that's a lot of what I see here. What we're doing now is, my first sponsor used to say, getting behaviorally sober was like lifting the hood of the car so you have access to the engine. He says it's totally essential, but it's not what it's about. You know, and the metaphor works perfectly, because in terms of relapse, if we're working on the engine and the hood comes slamming down on top of our heads, the priority is get the damn hood back off. So we have this. So I love that it's talking about beyond the alcohol. We shall need to make a brand new venture into open-mindedness. We shall need to raise, I love this. We need to raise our eyes toward perfection, this is really important, toward perfection, and be ready to walk in that direction. And I love, first of all, I love the fact that I love the internal rhyme of that sentence. We need to lift our eyes toward perfection and be ready to walk in that direction. It's like, it doesn't say you have to get there, because we're not going to get there. Next thing it says, it will seldom matter how haltingly we walk. The only question will be, are you ready? You know, this is a commitment to practice, you know. And one of the things I just look at every opportunity I have to repeat this, I will. You know, one of the most important things I've learned about practice just in the last few years, or that's actually gotten through to me, is that you do not have to be in the mood or in the right state of mind for practice to benefit you, you know, any more than, I think I've used this recently, is brushing. I do not have to feel like, oh, I just love brushing my teeth for me to brush my teeth and for my gums and teeth to benefit. It's like exercise is the same way. And so I've learned is my meditation, of my morning meditation, of the reading, I do the journaling I do. If I do those things, some of those things, and it's like, you know, I would go like, wow, how present was I for that? Well, maybe not so much, but I do it anyway. And what I have discovered through that is and I think this is what step 6 is for me, is you just keep doing it over and over and over again. it will, and you do that, it will benefit you. You need to be very, for me, it's about being very behaviorally specific about what that practice is.
Yep.
So that's what I got.
Wow, such good stuff. We could go on for all night long. I feel like
Yes,
we could do a
we
marathon. Look, I see step 6 is such a critical step. The way I have thought about it is that it's the step that we pivot. We've come from defining what's wrong, what's caused us problems in our life, what we've struggled with, what we've been struggling, what we continue to struggle with. And now we're pivoting towards the solution. This pivot is incredibly important. And oftentimes, and I think rightfully so, people say step 6 is not given the attention that it really deserves in terms of our program. And I agree with that, because this pivot, and I'll talk in a minute about what we're pivoting towards, is so critical. You know, one way you've heard me describe things before is what we're turning away from and what we're turning towards. You've heard Herb use that, you know, in terms of making a decision. What kind of a decision are you making? Well, you're turning towards something, right? That is towards your healthy self, right? Towards living a different kind of life, towards putting a part of you in charge of your life that hasn't been in charge. See, that's what we're really looking at. I'll get into more of this later, because this chapter in the 12 and 12 is so rich. Tom just read a few segments. I've got mine, as you can see, underlined, dog-eared. I mean, there's so much that can be said, but I'm limited in my time tonight, so I want to just highlight a few things. This is the step we're pivoting. Now, in order to pivot and to take the best possible attitude towards the exact nature of our wrongs, what do we have to do? Well, Bill makes it very clear in here, and it's psychologically so sound. I have to understand the functions of what he calls character defects. What we're going to call, adaptations, right? Faulty adaptations like. But I have to understand what their purpose is in life. Now, some of you may remember there was this whole movement in psychology that was based on, well, what is that doing for you? What are you getting out of that? What's the purpose of that in your life? That's what Bill is capturing here. He's saying we have to understand. So to do that, let me just go a little bit in that direction, and then I'll go more into the other stuff when I have my turn to discuss this step. Dr. Kempler, my mentor, said that there are 3 purposes to any kind of a psychological maladaptation, or what he would call a symptom, or what we call here a character defect. What are the 3 purposes that are involved? And we need to understand these, because if we're going to let them go, Bill said we have to. How did he put it? He said it so well. We must recognize now, is that we exult in some of our defects. We really love them. Well, why do we love them? Because they've been doing something for us. Now, I believe they're based on misinformation. They're based on a lie. They're based on a distortion of what is possible, or another way to say it, a lack of a realization of what is possible, that there's other ways to function better. But this is the best we could come up with. So we've got to understand these things that we developed are like a life preserver for us. Right. You're not going to let them go easily. You're just not. So I said there's 3 things. The first thing that these things do is they economize our distress. Mm-hmm. We do it because that we need to resolve the anxiety we're feeling. We need to resolve the fear. We need to find some way of dealing with the trauma. Someone that dissociates is coping with their trauma by not being overwhelmed all the time by the feelings they have. If I compartmentalize my feelings, it meant that it wasn't safe to feel my feelings. That's all. And that was a good response in the situation I was in, where it wasn't safe to feel my feelings. if you've stuck around Tom and I long enough, you hear we talk about the positive intention in all behavior. All behavior is motivated to ensure wholeness. Doesn't mean that it achieves that goal, but it is motivated to ensure as much wholeness as is possible at that time. It economizes our distress, number one. The second thing that Dr. Kempler said is that it tells us something about what was missing. If I had to cut off my feelings and compartmentalize my feelings because it wasn't safe, it means that it wasn't safe. Safety was missing. See, if I had to turn to myself and turn within, that means there was no one to turn to out there. If I had to figure out everything on my own and become needless and wantless, it meant that there was nobody there that was going to meet my needs. These are all adaptations. So now they give us a clue, ourselves a clue to what we need, the opposite. You'll hear us talk about that, contrary behavior, all the time. Herb was silent, he needed to talk. I mean, he needed to talk. And he keeps talking because he needs to keep talking. It's very healthy for him. It's that kind of stuff, right? We always think of the opposite, right? What is missing in our life that we had to adapt the way we did? That's the second function of these things. They give us a clue, right? And then they tell us, and the third thing is, and it's based on number 2, what direction we need to go in to start to deal with this. And that's where this contrary action comes in. Now, if I didn't feel safe when I choose to start to talk about this with someone, I want to talk about it with someone that I have a sense of safety with, that I think is going to be there for me and have compassion, not just unconditional positive regard and co-sign all my bullshit, but someone that's going to be there and sees that I'm more than what I've been doing, that sees the possibility inside of me to grow into what I can be. I'll leave my discussion that far tonight. We will be picking up more of this. Next week, Roger will be leading the discussion on step 6, followed by Tom, and then I will take up the last position. So once again, you guys, thank you very much. Very good discussion tonight. We've got some time left to have some shares. So Tom, I will invite you in. And Tom, do you want to say anything quickly about what we've said or anything you want to add to it tonight?
I could talk about 6 and 7 all night long. I just, like you say, this is the real turning step and how we shift towards the possibilities. I just posted in the chat, for those of you who haven't been here throughout our discussions of self-esteem and the works of Dr. Nathaniel Branden, we brought this up several times. He had a book that includes 6 pillars, and there was actually a 7th pillar. And as you guys were discussing the step 6 tonight, I went back and looked at these and how many of these line up and support step 6. These practices, living consciously, being aware of our character defects, the accepting them and taking responsibility for them, and then living purposely with integrity to move towards the better version of that. So it was just really lit up for me that these line up pretty closely, and I'm sure Roger will just bring up more of those as he leads next session.
I hear a lot of people criticize the 12 steps, that they're old-fashioned. I can understand that criticism. They were written back in 1935. Some people that are agnostic have difficulty with the word God used in the steps. For me, I look at the process that's involved, the forces that the 12 steps generate are so powerful that I think they're ageless. There's this interesting phenomena that happens when you work the steps. They create a charge and then a discharge. The first step, we're powerless. Our life has become unmanageable. It creates this charge. We're in big trouble and we don't know what to do. And then step 2 comes along and it says we have hope. That charge, that existential crisis that we have is resolved. What's happening here is parallel to life. We charge ourselves when we breathe in. When we exhale, we discharge. That's the rhythm of life. And the way I love to think about the 12 steps, it's helping us get connected to the rhythm of life so we can learn how to show up in a good way.